The 60s were some very interesting times. It was a pretty wild decade to grow up in, packed with huge social shifts, major breakthroughs that weren't thought possible, and an awestruck public that was trying to make sense of it all. There was so much happening at the same time that it was hard to make sense of it all, much less remember it decades later. So today, let's jog our memories and take a look at what you probably remember if you grew up in the 60s. 1. People were obsessed with baseball.
There's a little roller. Magley is going to try to get him, and does, scoring. K-line.
The 60s were a high point for baseball. If you grew up back then, you probably remember what it was like to watch some of the best players to ever come out of the sport live and in action. If you were a huge fan of baseball at the time, this was definitely an incredibly exciting decade. The early 60s saw the reign of the New York Yankees to an end. The team won the 61 and 62 World Series, but nothing else for the rest of the decade. Everybody was at the edge of their seats in anticipation when Major League Baseball added 4 expansion teams to the leagues, the San Diego Padres and Montreal Expos joining the National League, and the Kansas City Royals and Seattle Pilots joining the American League. You definitely wouldn't have been able to forget the 1916-1 Major League Baseball season, when Roger Maris and Mickey Mantle were in a race to break Babe Ruth's record of 60 home runs in a single season. This contest would end on October the 1st, when Maris hit his 61st home run against the Boston Red Sox on the last game of the season, beating Mantle to claim the record. Only fans of the sport could truly understand the magnitude of Maris beating the Commerce Comet, arguably the best player in the league. The public's love for baseball went way beyond the field, though. Baseball cards were a popular obsession, a major staple of the culture. Kids back then would walk into the candy store or the mall during their free time and splurge their savings on all the baseball cards they could get, of which the Topps baseball cards were the most popular. Non-sports cards like comic book and movie cards were also pretty popular, so most kids also went for a mix of them. Two children playing outdoors. Growing up in the 60s, children spent much of their time outside. The outdoors was where adventures were had. Young children had the freedom to roam the street without adult supervision after dark. After school, kids would rush out the door, often unsupervised, to play in the neighborhood until dusk. Whether it was a game of tag, hide and seek, or hopscotch, the streets were filled with the laughter and shouts of children. If you were like most children back then, you were what people often called a free-range kid. During the weekends and on summer break, you were free to let loose with little to no restrictions, pretty much, right from when you were old enough to make your way around the neighborhood. Sure, there were curfews, but they were late enough in the night not to spoil your fun. Kids were free to make their own decisions on where to go, whether it was the community pool, a store downtown, the park, a friend's house, or just leave town altogether and check out the bush by the river. Because this was before the era of cell phones, parents often had no idea where their children were and had no way to find them. They just had to trust that they'd come home, and they always did. One of the most cherished memories of the time was playing with friends in the local park or empty lots. These spaces were transformed into imaginary worlds where anything was possible. That was the life of a 60s kid. The children were left to roam and grow at their own pace. 3. Bicycle riding. Bicycles were also a major part of childhood back then. They weren't just a means of transportation, they were a symbol of freedom. A bike allowed you to explore beyond your immediate neighborhood, visiting friends' houses or venturing into the nearby woods. And the best part? You didn't need to wear a helmet. The lack of strict safety regulations meant kids often rode their bikes with the wind in their hair, free from worry. For many 60s kids, this would be their first taste of freedom. The bike of choice for most kids at the time was the Schwinn Stingray, with its ape-hanger handlebars, sissy bars, and elongated banana seats that came in a variety of colors. As if it couldn't get any cooler, the Stingray also looked a lot like a chopper motorcycle, which made it a major must-have food for kids back then. It was something you saw every kid powering through your neighborhood streets on, and if they didn't have it, you could be sure it was at the top of their wish list. Bicycling was mostly seen as a thing kids did, at least back then. It wasn't that adults weren't riding bicycles back in the 60s, but they were few and far between. Nearly everyone riding a bike was at most under 16. In fact, for a lot of kids back then, they often quit cycling once they hit their late teens, believing they were now too old to be riding bikes. Roller skating was also pretty popular at the time. While these primitive roller skates came with ball bearings, the skater still needed a pair of shoes with strong leather soles if they didn't want friction burn. To wear the skates, you needed to clamp them on the shoes with a skate key. They were pretty heavy, especially compared to modern roller skates, but if you were lucky enough to get a pair, you eventually got used to them and learned how to maneuver them. Misplacing the key was usually the biggest problem with these skates, so skaters would often wear the key on a string around their neck for the space race.
Until 2 days ago, that sound had never been heard on this earth. Suddenly, it has become as much a part of 20th century life as the whir of your vacuum cleaner.
In the 60s, the space race was on everyone's mind. Every kid back then wanted to grow up and become an astronaut, inspired by the idea of exploring the unknown frontiers of space. If you were around back then, you probably remember tuning in on your school's TVS to watch all the space launches, landings, and re-entries. Astronauts were more like superheroes back then. So when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed a spacecraft on the moon in 1969, and Armstrong uttered the iconic phrase, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," it was like seeing your favorite sci-fi TV show come to life. Space food. At the peak of the space race, we just couldn't get enough of space food, most especially the kids, and the most notable of this being Tang. It might have first hit the market in 1957, but when you think of Tang, you probably also think of the space race in the 60s. This powdery drink mix brand first came into prominence after it became a staple of early manned NASA space flights. While there were a ton of alternatives even then, Tang was a favorite of astronauts, especially because of how it could be mixed into water containers easily. Not to mention its refreshing taste and all the flavors it came in. After legendary astronaut John Glenn was chugging the stuff while making his historic trip round the globe in 1962, everybody was drinking Tang. But what was the point of chugging some Tang if you weren't wolfing down some space food sticks by the side? These treats were the second half of the space food craze that was in full swing in the 60s, and the kids loved it so much you were guaranteed to find them snacking down on the treat everywhere, so much so that they were a common lunchbox item. Much like actual space food, they had a weird chewy texture that came in 6 flavors and packed a mean punch in calories. Pop culture in the 60s.
I've got something to say that might cause you pain.
The suburban lifestyle, with its neatly manicured lawns, modern homes, and good schools, was the epitome of this dream. If you were a child in the 60s, you might remember the excitement of moving into a new house in a sprawling suburban development, where every home looked similar but promised a better, more comfortable life. The suburbs were a place where families could feel safe, communities could thrive, and children could grow up in a wholesome environment. Aside social change and a general shift in perception, the 1960s also saw the rise of popular culture in a way that had never been seen before. Music, fashion, and movies all began to influence each other, creating a new youth-driven culture. Seven Boys Life magazine. You probably remember the Boys Life magazine, the monthly magazine for the Boy Scouts. This scouting magazine was a must-have with 60s kids, to the point where it seemed like every boy growing up back then had a subscription. Especially beloved was the magazine's mascot donkey, Pedro, who you'd often find in his own column near the front page giving advice on camping gear, camping skills, and how to solve real-life problems with camping, fishing, backpacking, and cooking skills. If you were a faithful reader of the magazine back then, you probably remember the comic series The Wacky Adventures of Pedro, where Pedro and a group of Boy Scouts would teach the readers scouting skills. 8. Cap gun revolvers. If you were one of the more adventurous kids, the type that you'd find playing cops and robbers, or maybe even cowboys and Indians, you definitely had a realistic-looking toy cap gun revolver that you took everywhere. This trend was driven by the growing popularity of TV in the 60s and the rise of spaghetti westerns with the young suburbanites of the time. All the big toy companies at the time caught on the trend and quickly went all in on manufacturing these toy guns. These cap guns were typically named with popular spaghetti western-sounding phrases like Stallion 45, Pony, Mustang, Pioneer, Cowboy, and such. Kids back then fell in love with these toys. It was their way of emulating all the heroes from their favorite TV shows. There were many types of cap guns for kids to play with in their heyday, from small derringers to big rifles, and even working miniatures of most of them. These toy guns would pop and even smoke when fired, adding some extra realism to their outdoor play fights. 9. Sci-fi movies. Talking about movies, the first television show most 60s kids watched in color was the animated series The Jetsons that first aired on primetime television on September 23, 1962. The show might have aired for just 24 episodes and aired for less than a year, but its impact far outlived its runtime. Another popular sci-fi series of the time was Star Trek. Popular might have been an understatement for just how much of a big deal Star Trek was at the time and the magnitude of the cultural phenomenon it was. For the 3 seasons that it aired, 60s kids back then would tune into the TV at night for another voyage aboard the starship USS Enterprise. Both shows, especially Star Trek, opened the minds of a lot of kids to what the future could hold, and the sci-fi series also sparked the interest of a lot of kids in technology. 10 music in the 60s. Music was an essential part of life growing up in the 60s. This was the decade when rock and roll truly came into its own, and the music scene exploded with creativity, innovation, and energy. The Beatles, who made their American debut in 1964 on The Ed Sullivan Show, became a cultural phenomenon, with their music and style influencing everything from fashion to attitudes toward authority. The Beatles were just the tip of the iceberg, to be honest. The 60s saw the rise of a multitude of iconic artists and bands that would define the era. The Rolling Stones brought a raw, rebellious edge to rock, while the Beach Boys captured the sunny, carefree spirit of California with their harmonies and surf-inspired sound. Bob Dylan's folk music, infused with socially conscious lyrics, became the anthem of the protest movement, while Motown brought the sounds of soul and R&B to mainstream audiences, with artists like Marvin Gaye, The Supremes, and Stevie Wonder leading the charge. Music was everywhere, in your home, on the radio, and at live concerts that became a rite of passage for many teenagers. The transistor radio, a relatively new invention, allowed young people to take their music with them wherever they went, tuning in to the latest hits on stations like WABC in New York or KHJ in Los Angeles. The music of the 60s wasn't just entertainment, it was a form of expression, a way for young people to connect with each other and with the broader cultural movements of the time. 11 live performances. The decade also saw the birth of the music festival, with Woodstock in 1969 becoming the most legendary of them all. Billed as 3 days of peace and music, Woodstock brought together over 400,000 people to a farm in upstate New York to listen to performances by artists like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and The Who. It was a defining moment for the counterculture movement, symbolizing the idealism, creativity, and rebellious spirit of the 60s. Music wasn't just about the big names and major events, though. For many, it was also about the joy of playing records at home, hosting dance parties in basements and living rooms, or jamming with friends in garages. The soundtracks of childhood and adolescence were made up of the songs that played on the radio during long car rides, the records spun at sleepovers, and the tunes that blasted from jukeboxes at diners and soda shops. 12. Fashion in the 60s. Fashion in the 60s was also a vivid expression of the cultural changes that were sweeping through society. If you were a young person during this decade, you likely witnessed, and perhaps even participated in, the radical transformation of style that moved away from the buttoned-up looks of the 1950s to something far more daring and expressive. The early 60s were still dominated by the classic styles of the previous decade. Men wore suits, ties, and hats, while women favored dresses, pearls, and perfectly coiffed hair. But as the decade progressed, fashion became a vehicle for the younger generation to assert their identity and break away from the norms of their parents. The rise of the miniskirt, popularized by British designer Mary Quant, was one of the most iconic fashion trends of the 60s. It symbolized the liberation and boldness of the youth culture, and it was embraced by women who wanted to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable. Alongside the miniskirt, other trends like go-go boots, psychedelic prints, and bold colors reflected the influence of pop art and the counterculture movement. In the fashion world, go-go boots were all the rave for young women. The iconic original style of the go-go boots, with their shiny white leathery finish, low-heeled cut, and mid-calf height, a specific style became a major fixation for the young women that were trying to go for the Bond look that was popular at the time. For men, the 60s brought about a loosening of traditional styles. The influence of British bands like the Beatles led to the popularity of mod fashion, characterized by slim-cut suits, turtlenecks, and Chelsea boots. As the decade progressed, men's fashion became even more experimental, with the rise of hippie style. Think bell-bottom jeans, tie-dye shirts, and long hair becoming symbols of rebellion against the establishment. 13. 60s hair. Hair was another major aspect of 60s fashion. For women, the beehive and bouffant hairstyles of the early years gave way to more natural looks, influenced by the hippie movement's emphasis on freedom and individuality. For men, the crew cuts and short hair of the 50s were replaced by longer, shaggier styles, reflecting a more relaxed and countercultural attitude. Accessories were also important. Women embraced bold jewelry, large sunglasses, and colorful scarves, while men began experimenting with hats, necklaces, and even more flamboyant pieces like paisley shirts and wide ties. The fashion of the 60s was all about breaking the rules and expressing individuality, and it helped to cement the idea that young people could drive cultural trends. 14. Cuisine in the 60s. Speaking of food, family meals were an integral part of daily life in that period. Dinner time was sacred, and families would gather around the dining table to share a meal, talk about their day, and connect with one another. This was before the era of fast food dominance, so home-cooked meals were the norm. Moms, many of whom were full-time homemakers, would spend hours preparing meals from scratch, using recipes passed down through generations. The kitchen was the heart of the home, where the smell of pot roast, meatloaf, or fried chicken filled the air. There was a comfort in the predictability of these meals. Meat and potatoes were staples, often accompanied by vegetables like green beans, peas, or corn. Desserts were a special treat, with homemade pies, cakes, and cookies making regular appearances. Sunday dinners were especially significant, often bringing extended family together for a larger feast. It was a time for grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins to gather, share stories, and enjoy each other's company. The tradition of the family meal not only provided nourishment, but also reinforced family bonds, instilling values of togetherness and communication. For the kids who really couldn't wait to grow up and start cooking, there was the Easy Bake Toy Oven, released by Kenner in the early 60s, for little kids to make their own meals. The oven came complete with packets of cake mix, small round pans, and recipes for the kids to bake their own treats. After it was done cooking, the finished pastry would be pushed out through a slot in the other end. 15 Jell-O salads and TV dinners. The 60s also saw the beginning of convenience foods. While home-cooked meals were the standard, the introduction of TV dinners, Jell-O salads, and canned soups made meal preparation quicker and easier, hinting at the changes to come in the following decades. Jell-O molds were a pretty standard staple of recipes in the 60s. They were ubiquitous on dinner tables, and jiggling molds could be packed with a variety of ingredients, ranging from fruits and marshmallows to nuts and even vegetables. Later in the decade, Jell-O even introduced more complex flavors like celery, mixed vegetable, and Italian salad. On the other hand, Swanson TV dinners were everyone's favorite last-minute dinner. These were pre-portioned, pre-packaged, ready-made frozen meals that you just needed to toss into the microwave. They offered a variety of luxurious main dishes, including turkey, Salisbury steak, and even fried chicken. TV dinners back even came with a compartment for dessert, which was normally a fruit cobbler or brownie that would typically still be kept scalding hot relative to the main dish. Looking back on the busy lifestyles people were leading back in those days, TV dinners were more than just a time saver, they were a lifesaver. 16. The rise of television and evening cruises. Talking about television, you probably remember how it was everywhere in the 60s. For a lot of kids back then, spending your evenings huddling up in front of the TV screen to watch your favorite shows was a formative memory. More than ever, TVs were now a central part of family life. This was before the days of cable or streaming services, so everyone watched the same few channels: ABC, CBS, NBC, and maybe one or two local stations if you were lucky. Teenagers eagerly awaited the day they could get their driver's license, which represented a rite of passage into adulthood. Cruising around town with friends, listening to the radio, and stopping at drive-ins for a burger and milkshake were quintessential teenage experiences. Cars were a central part of social life, with many weekends spent washing, waxing, and showing off your ride. 17. The fear of the Cold War. Growing up in the 60s meant living under the shadow of the Cold War. The tension between the United States and the Soviet Union permeated every aspect of life, from politics to pop culture. For those who were children during this time, the threat of nuclear war was a constant, if sometimes abstract, fear. Schools conducted regular duck and cover drills, where students were taught to hide under their desks in case of a nuclear attack. While these drills might seem quaint or ineffective in hindsight, they were the only way people knew to calm tensions and manage the paranoia that was ever present at the time. Many families built bomb shelters in their backyards, stocked with canned goods and water, just in case the worst happened. 18. The Vietnam War. If you were old enough to make sense of the events of the time, you almost definitely remember living in the background of all the chaos of the Vietnam War. This conflict, which escalated throughout the decade, had a profound impact on American society and left deep scars on the national psyche. For those who came of age during this time, the Vietnam War was more than just a news story. It was a constant presence that influenced nearly every aspect of life. The war began in the early 60s, but by the mid-60s, the U.S. had put hundreds of thousands of troops to the conflict, leading to a war that was broadcasted nightly into American homes. This was the first war where television played a major role, bringing the brutal realities of combat into living rooms across the country. It was on the news every night, and towards the end of the decade, it was one of the few major stories that were ever present on the American conscious. If you were a young man at the time, or you had a loved one who was one, the Vietnam War was a looming threat. The draft was in effect, and many teenagers and young adults faced the possibility of being sent to fight in a war they didn't fully understand or support. The draft lottery, introduced in 1969, was a source of anxiety and fear for many, as it determined their fate based on the random luck of the draw. The idea of being forced into military service, especially for a war that was increasingly seen as unjust or unwinnable, led to widespread protests and draft resistance. The anti-war movement was a defining feature of the 1960s, with college campuses becoming hotbeds of activism and dissent. If you were a teenager or a young adult at the time, you probably remember hearing about the Kent State shootings in 1970, where National Guardsmen killed 4 students during an anti-war protest. The Vietnam War didn't just affect those who fought in it, it also had a lasting impact on the entire generation that grew up in its shadow. 19. Games in the 60s. Ending things on a lighter note, think back. What were your favorite games in the 60s? One game that had everyone spellbound, and which was usually the centerpiece and the life of every party, was the wildly popular Twister. It was a huge ruckus of a game, and was a generally great time for the people playing it. Popularly known as the game that ties you up in knots, Twister was a game of physical skill that was typically on a large plastic mat that would be spread on the ground. A spinner attached to a square board would be used to determine where the player has to put their hand or foot. The spinner would be divided into 4 labeled sections: left foot, left hand, and right hand, with each section divided into 4 colors. After spinning, the combination would be called, and players would move their matching hand or foot to a circle of the correct color. In a 2-player game, no 2 people could have a hand or foot on the same circle. If there were more players, though, the rules would be entirely different. Because there were only so many colored circles, players would eventually put themselves in pretty precarious positions, eventually causing them to fall. Players would when they fell, or when their elbow or knee touched the mat. It was an incredibly physical game, athletic in a way that a lot of people nowadays would not be able to relate to. Some other pretty popular toys of this era were Hot Wheels, Barbie, and G.I. Joe. Space-related toys were also pretty popular with the kids of the time. Toys like astronaut trolls were pretty much everywhere in the 1960s, and up until the mid-60s, they were the undisputed best-selling toys on the market. These astronaut troll dolls were an extension of the Troll Dolls line, this miniature brand of toys with oversized heads and spiky hair. They were basically just troll dolls in astronaut suits, but that didn't matter. Everybody wanted one. Looking at some other classic toys from this period, who can forget back when the entire country was pretty much obsessed with Rock'em Sock'em robots and knocking their heads off? Or what about the incredibly flexible Major Matt Mason action figure line from Mattel, the toy astronaut that you could bend at the knees and elbows, although eventually the wireframes would often wear out and break over time. Super Balls were another pretty popular novelty toy at the time. Kids would have the time of their lives bouncing this extremely elastic ball as high off the ground as possible before running off to chase it. And that's it for the video, folks. Growing up in the 1960s was an experience like no other. What part of growing up back then do you think we left out? Feel free to let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and of course, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Also, tap the bell so you get notified every time we post a new video.